Good day, friends. Welcome to this episode of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. My name is Nolan Johnson. I am your occasional co-host and producer of the program. This week, we have Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Clay sits down with the professor of history from Norfolk State University in Virginia, whose work has focused on African American history, public memory, and civic engagement. Together, they take stock of where we are as a nation as we approach our 250th birthday. They ask, what does freedom mean when it has not always been shared? What does equality look like when the founding promise was never truly extended at all? They begin with Jefferson's famous sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." It's a phrase we've come to revere, but did Jefferson mean what he wrote? And Dr. Newby-Alexander will take on that question. How do we reconcile the poetry of those words with the reality that Jefferson and other founders enslaved people, shaping a nation where race was not just a social division, but legal and an economic structure? Should we hold the founders accountable, or is it more important to understand them in the full context of their time? Jefferson himself once expressed doubt that black and white Americans would ever live together as equals in a biracial republic. Was he being honest or simply avoiding the moral consequences of his own choices because he was not willing to give up the lifestyle that he lived? This is an honest and thought-provoking exchange between Dr. Newby-Alexander and Clay Jenkinson. We appreciate her sharing her view of the past, the limits of historical memory, and what the future could look like in Norfolk, Virginia, and the rest of America. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. Head over to ltamerica.org. Follow Clay on his current journey across the nation in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. Check out the social media channels to view all of the video content that we create. Sign up for the weekly newsletter at the website and hear from Clay on a weekly basis there. Let's go to the program again. This is not a debate, it's a dialogue grounded in history as America approaches its 250th birthday. Let's go to the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I have the distinct pleasure of sitting virtually across from Cassandra Newby-Alexander. She's been on this program before. We talked about the Underground Railroad in Virginia, among other things. Cassandra, welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be back.
So I want to really just jump right in here. We have an hour to talk about America. 250th birthday of the country is coming next year, July 4th. Unclear how we will commemorate that. It's not going to be a celebration exactly. Commemoration, observation, not certain, but I know that it's going to be an interesting national conversation, and I want you to be part of it. So let me just pick it up from the beginning. Africans and African Americans have been here for 400 years, at least. Most of them brought here against their will.
Yes.
Not incorporated into American social life, even now fully, but for most of American history, essentially a nation of apartheid. Let's begin with Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Did he mean it, Cassandra?
He meant it for his group. He saw the world through his lens in the same way that so many people today who are part of the elite see the world through their lens and the people who surround them. And when they make statements such as everybody agrees with me, they're only talking about the people in their circle. And their circle tends to be small. It always has been very, very small. And part of it is they don't really care about the other people because they see them as inferiors or as the outsiders who then would be controlled by them. And that's been the history of our nation from the very beginning when the Jamestown settlement was created and the forerunner of the House of Burgesses was formed in 1619, and they began to create policies and, what we call today laws for the colony. And they left out so many people. And the freedoms that we talk about when we talk about the American Revolution were never considered to be applied to everyone, and especially not the people that they called the others.
So when
And the
Jefferson writes those bold words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One way to look at that is that he meant it in some vague Jeffersonian, utopian, universal sense, but it didn't have to actually apply yet, if ever. That's a nice way to read Jefferson's statement. A less rosy way would be to say he never meant to include anybody but white people from the start. It's just boilerplate. I mean, it's not a universal statement. It's a statement of a white elite wanting to separate politically and economically from another white elite.
I think that Jefferson was a very deep thinker. I think he recognized the hypocrisies that he practiced in his own life and economies. I think that he had a lot of aspirational goals, but he was not personally ready to practice any of those goals in his current existence because it would mean sacrifice and loss on his part. And so he vacillated. In fact, in a lot of his correspondences with the Marquis de Lafayette, who trounced him for his hypocrisies, he gave all kinds of excuses and finally, acknowledged, as well, this is my situation. And so I think that as a philosopher, as a student of Enlightenment thinking, he thought beyond the current. He was trying to think about, where do I want this nation to be in the future, long in the future? And I want this nation to be able to grow and to have aspirational goals. And so I really believe that he thought that, but at the same time, he wasn't ready for those aspirational goals to be applied to his current situation.
So are we glad that he wrote these words that Lincoln said we must now take universally, no matter what Jefferson meant by them? We can't go on unless we take those famous words as a universal statement of human right? Or do we just regard Jefferson as a contemptible hypocrite?
Well, the state of human beings is that we're all hypocrites to some degree. So I'm not going to throw him into the deepest, darkest parts of hell for being a hypocrite. I think that he also acknowledged his hypocrisy, and excuse made, for that hypocrisy. I think that what is untenable are the some of the justices that we have today in the Supreme Court who want to parse out pieces of that are convenient to their political argument. They are not jurists in the truest sense, because a jurist in the truest sense acknowledges rule of law, acknowledges precedents that have happened in the past and where we are today, and has an aspirational goal, for the future. It's troubling to me when I hear originalists talk, because for the originalists, I really want to say, well, if you go with that, you wouldn't be voting. If we actually go with those originalist ideas, you would not be a part of this conversation. You wouldn't even be in the position that you're holding currently.
Yes, the Three-Fifths Clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, the whole world of the Constitution, to put it nicely, kicked the can down the road of how we were finally going to come to terms with race and slavery in the United States. And it was a series of very ugly compromises. As you know, 55 white men, many of them slaveholders, built this Constitution, and so on. So it was bad enough at the beginning from the point of view of race. And now we're in this period where we seem to be wanting to go retrograde into a more segregated society. So obviously, things have changed dramatically in the course of American history. African Americans today are in a dramatically better position than they were in 1787. But when you look at it from 40,000 feet, Cassandra, when you look down on the whole history of America, it seems to me that Jefferson's final judgment about this is still a question in America. He said he had very serious doubts that we could be a biracial republic. He said, yes, of course, we're going to emancipate the slaves. That's inevitable. But he was very clear, wasn't he, that he didn't think that white people and black people could really share a republic.
Yes, he was. He believed ultimately that because when you talk about a biracial society, you're talking about not just the reality, because people were intermixing from the first time that Europeans stepped onto this continent. You know that a lot of the first Africans who were forced to come here integrated themselves and disappeared as Black people into white society because they began to intermarry with white people. And so he was really referring to the reality of acknowledging that there are two separate races of people who have citizenship, who have standing in society. And we have been fighting over that since, I would say, the really definitely by the 18th century, but even before, when we were back in the 1650s, 1660s. Whether or not we can actually change, well, I'm kind of hopeful about that. I believe that what has drawn so many people from so many different societies and cultures to America is this aspirational idea. It's not just about making money, but it's about being accepted in society without regard to race, creed, or color. And while people bring all of their prejudices with them, if a society has the aspirational goal that we're not going to be like other countries and other societies that hold a very strong straight line of race and certain races or certain ethnicities leading the charge, if we don't have that kind of society, we have a more open society. It is something that human beings generally really want, because holding the line about race or ethnicity is about power, and holding that power solely to yourself and your descendants. Opening that up is a human aspirational goal. And I think that Jefferson was really, and I'm going to say something very controversial, but I think Jefferson was looking at when white men are in charge. This is never going to happen as long as white men are completely in charge. But I think that America is at a critical threshold point. Where we go in the next 10 years will determine whether we survive as we are currently in the next 100 years. And I believe that we are going to make some decisions and determinations about what will happen to our future. There's an effort to break down the system to restore it. And you can't break down a system to restore something. When you break down a system, you break it. And so in the broken particles that will remain after this administration, where will we be rebuilding? And when we rebuild, I think it's going to be using somewhat of a different foundational platform. So that's my hope. And I said about 30 years ago, we were entering the last gasp of elite white men. And what we do in the next 25 years will determine the next 50 years of our existence as a nation. And unfortunately, I could see where we were headed.
We need to take a short break. I'm talking to Cassandra Newby-Alexander, professor of history at Norfolk State in Virginia, a friend of mine. I'm so eager to meet you in person one of these days. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you what you mean by this critical moment. Stay tuned, everyone. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, talking with Cassandra Newby-Alexander. We talked before about Virginia and the Underground Railroad. Now I'm asking her to talk from 50,000 feet about the broad sweep of history in America. You know, a lot of white people will say this, Cassandra, that was then, and this is now. Slavery's gone, Black people can vote, and Jim Crow's over, and all that, lynching's done. I'm not complicit. I never was involved in this. My family comes from Germany. So get over it already, Black people. Stop victimizing yourself. Stop being stuck. Join the party or be quiet. You know this. You've heard this all of your life. What's missing in that perspective?
I would say what's missing is reality. If we spent almost 400 years creating a thing, if you want equality, you have to dismantle the infrastructure of inequality. And we have done very little of dismantling it. What we've done is we've added laws of supposed protection while maintaining or keeping on the books those laws that could be enforced in the future. And to give you an example, when our governor in Virginia, Ralph Northam, was governor, and the blackface story came out, I was one of those who did not want him to resign. And so our group, we were in the process of creating the Center for African American Public Policy. This was something that I envisioned, and I had a few colleagues join me in doing so from Norfolk State University. And we had an appointment. We set up an appointment with the governor's office, and we were there for the entire day. We had a meeting with the governor for a solid hour. And he had all of his different people meet with us, and we proposed several different things. One of them was that this was an opportunity that he had to really change Virginia. And so one of the first things that we recommended was have a commission to look at all the laws that are still on Virginia's books that had some sort of discrimination involved. That commission got together and basically had the General Assembly eliminate almost 200 laws from the books. And this commission was made up of judges and attorneys and law professors, and all of them, Black and white and Asian, all of them were shocked by how many laws were still on the books. And so we said, eliminate them, because you don't want somebody coming back later on and trying to enforce this law, because even though this other law is on the book, they can remove that other law and that one stays on the books. So that's what they did. They were in the process of removing or recommending the removal of over 200 laws that had coded messaging, but it was still discriminatory. And that's when our current governor came in and stopped all of that. There was another commission looking at educational standards that included African American history, educational standards that included Native history, educational standards that included both Asian and Hispanic history. And all of that got pushed back, stopped, and squashed.
Why push? Why those getting rid of 200 antiquated laws that can only be a nuisance and maybe worse seems like a perfectly reasonable thing, a nonpartisan thing to do. Why would the current governor push back?
There was nothing said except the favorite phrase that this is divisive. I'm not stupid. I understand what that translates into. You don't want to. You don't want to because you want a society that discriminates. you want to leave those laws on the books. In fact, there has just been this huge push to eliminate all protective laws that were put in place from the 1960s moving forward. In fact, you have some people who want to go back to the pre-progressive period of the turn of the 20th century to allow children to work in factories, allow and have no minimum wage, maximum working hours, eliminate the right of women to vote, eliminate all the rights except for elite white men. So you have that's in the works, where people are trying to push for that. The problem is that you cannot push a society 150 years back. You might be able to push society 20 years back, and you're really on that edge right there. Because once people are accustomed to certain freedoms, they don't want to and will fight if you try to remove those freedoms. Now, I know there have been a lot of comparisons between the Reconstruction period in American history following the Civil War and now, but I remind people Reconstruction happened right after the Civil War. So you're only talking about a few years where people had rights, and it was really Black men had rights. And so just a few years to pull that back was a lot easier than pulling back 20, 30, 100 years of people having rights.
That's excellent. Thank you. So you said before we went to the break that we're at a critical moment, that this is a very critical moment in American history, and the next 10 years are going to tell us, in some sense, who we are. I want you to expand on that, but let me first confess that when Barack Obama was elected to the presidency of the United States, I thought, this is fabulous. Well, maybe we're entering a kind of post-racial era. Maybe something has changed in the American mix, that all those roiling events from 1960 onward have really changed the body of the American people, and we are in a new, more tolerant, more respectful period, and that race will not cease to matter, but it will cease to be so central to the way we think about America. And of course, we were all shocked to see that that was almost a stillborn dream, and the pushback was mighty and profound. Cassandra, there are 340 million Americans. How many of them, I know it's an impossible question, but what percentage would you say would like to have Black people and others of color regarded as subordinate?
I would say about a third of our population.
That's a large number, isn't it?
Well, you know what? I look at the long view. At the turn of the 20th century, we had 80%. When I look now, if we're only at 30%, hey, that
Progress.
this is a reduction, because what do historians say? And sociologists, it takes at least half the time to dismantle a thing than it took to create a thing. And so I think we're still in the dismantling phase. And it annoyed me to hear people say, once Obama was elected president, that we were in a post-racial society. And it's like, stop. That first of all, that's ridiculous. Secondly, you're trying to eliminate statistics that we need to keep because we're not in a post-racial society. Just because a large proportion of our population who are white voted for Obama does not mean that they're still not prejudiced. And people were making these statements. Some of them were making it because they had ulterior motives. Other people were making it because they were parroting other folks, and it suited them to think that way because now I don't have to look at myself. And so, a lot of African Americans were like, when is the ball going to drop from this situation? And so when it did, people were not surprised. They were anticipating that this could happen. And of course it did. I think what people were upset about with this last election is that misogyny is still such a big deal in our society. And this toxic masculinity is a side effect of the changing society. As society shifts, as men are no longer seen as the only ones who have the brains to run things. And anybody who knows women knows that's not true anyway. But women have historically and culturally been told, step aside, allow a man to be at the forefront, even though you might be behind him telling him everything he needs to do. You do not need to be at the forefront. And so our society has been that way forever. Many human societies have been like that. And when women step out to the front, you can see different examples throughout human history of when women were at the forefront. They were called all kinds of horrible names. And some women even took to presenting themselves as a man in public so that their femininity would not be seen as an obstacle. And so we are still in this transitional phase in our society of living up to those aspirations. Because, one of the things that people remind me constantly, and I remind myself, is when Jefferson wrote those words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We still have that 800-pound gorilla in the room. And that is this notion of a patriarchal society that somehow if women take the reins of power in this area or that area, that it somehow demeans the position of a man. And it really doesn't, but our society has that particular perception.
So yes, you said that African Americans were not as deluded as perhaps some white liberals when Barack Obama was elected, thinking, "Oh, this is like, here we go, problem solved, race over." But one thing I think is so interesting is that there was the profound backlash, a lot of it coded, but there was a gigantic backlash, and it can't be regarded
Yes.
as Obama's policies. It has to be regarded as Obama's status as an African American man, brilliantly educated, the law review, forget all that. But then I think when Donald Trump came along, he licensed people. He told people, go ahead and be your white supremacist self. Go ahead and be your misogynist self. Go ahead and express your toxic masculinity. I'm liberating those energies that people have been telling you to overcome or to crush. Be the thing you feel like being. Don't you think that if you add that kerosene to the reaction against Obama, you get this moment?
Yes, absolutely. Let's unleash the worst aspects of human beings and then expect that somehow things are not going to devolve into chaos. The reason that we have a society with rules of behavior is because if you allow society to be like Lord of the Flies, you are going to have anarchy and chaos. People will turn on each other because human beings are selfish, evil little buggers. And so you have to have some kind of control. That's why parent. That's why they teach children how to behave in certain circumstances. You don't want people to be unleashed with everything that they are capable of doing. You want them to limit their worst impulses. You want them to be mindful of other people's needs, not just your wants. And when you are like that, then you become kind. Then you become generous. Then you think of other people. And as you think of other people, it benefits you as well. But if you have a person who's encouraging people to embrace their demons rather than their best angels, then you are laying the groundwork for anarchy and destruction, because hate does not stay in one place, and it's not just directed to one group. Hate becomes cancer, and it spreads out to other things as well.
Civics education is at an all-time low in America. The sense one gets is that most young people, particularly, but older people too, don't really know how the system works. And meanwhile, the tripartite system of the national government has broken down. The Congress is not a check against the executive. The Supreme Court is in a very funky state right now. Lots of things are going on, but you are, in the long run, an optimist about all this.
I am. I come out with my dire predictions at times, but I am an optimist. And I'm an optimist because I believe in the American dream.
Mhm.
And I don't, and my American dream is not this financial thing that some people just focus on. Because I don't think people come here, so many people who are fleeing violence in their countries are not coming here to make money. They're coming here to live, and to live in a way that's free of daily violence. And so I do believe in that American dream of an opportunity to be free from all of that. During the antebellum period, and especially after Congress passed the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, people who were freedom seekers were after opportunity. The opportunity to live without abuse, to live without someone possibly separating them from their families, to live without fear of being sexually abused or killed or beaten to within an inch of their lives. To have that freedom, that opportunity to be, simply to be, that to me is where, when I think of the American dream, I think of that. And I think that as people experience a lot of challenges, especially with ICE coming in and trying to throw everyone into jail who's not fitting into this idea of what an American is supposed to look like or be like or sound like. I think that whole idea of opportunity is going to start coming at us once again. When you consider 10 years after that 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was passed, where America was 10 years later, on a verge of a civil war. Well, I know a lot of people keep talking about civil war, civil war. We're not in 1850 or 1860. America's a whole different place. And so those possibilities, there may be some groups who are trying to do that, but they're going to get squashed by everyone else, because one thing that we have successfully done as a nation is armed everybody. And so, you're not going to have, the same kind of scenario. And people need to understand, the situation is not an apple and apple comparison here. So our society, I believe, is going to wake up. Now, exactly how long it takes to wake up and what we're going to wake up to and all the ways that we're going to react, we'll have to wait and see.
I think a great conversation with Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander of Norfolk State, her second appearance on Listening to America. I'm so enjoying your commentary. We're looking sort of broadly at the history of African Americans in the United States and at the current situation and the future. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm talking with Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Cassandra, always right, never listened to. That's the status of the Cassandra of the Iliad. So you live in Lower Virginia.
Yes.
How much discrimination have you experienced in your life?
Well, I am 67 years old. And so I have seen a lot, not nearly like my parents, but I've seen a lot. When I was an undergraduate, I went to the University of Virginia. 3 years after they started allowing women to go to the university, about not quite 10 years after they admitted African Americans into the university. And so that was my first experience in dealing with racism at a very personal one-on-one level. And I, my parents were very clear about who they were and what they were willing to tolerate. My father was a person who he was a physician. He was a specialist in internal medicine, and he loved to read. And he was respected by all the physicians in our region, both Black and white. And he would read the dictionary every day, in addition to all of his medical journals and books, because he believed in stretching his mind and understanding the world. My mother was the same way. Even though she retired as a teacher after she started having children, she invested her life in us. And trust me, she continued to be a teacher when we were growing up. And she attended every event that we were a part of. And when my father died at a very early age, she continued to push us beyond where we thought we could be without telling us what she expected us to be. She allowed us to find our own pathway, but that path was always about being excellent at what you do, and being very strong about who you are, and not letting anybody push you around. And I found that that was really important when I came upon people who didn't have sense enough to know basic things. As a light skinned African American, I had a lot of people come to me in the early years of integration, because I was a part of the first busing that happened, and even the experimental busing that went on. And I had white children come up to me and ask me, so do you have anything other than African in your ancestry? And I would look at them and I said, no. Why do you ask? And they wouldn't know what to say. They'd start stammering. And I would say, you're asking me to prove to you what you can already see. Now, I'm 13 years old saying this, by the way. And it was because of how I was raised. And I said, the better question, if you're going to get all personal and in my business, the better question to ask is, what do I have in my ancestry? Because it's clear you're not just of African descent. Now, whether or not that stuck with them or not, I hope it did. But that is how I handle things. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor that I was working with who believed in the Hamitic myth. She believed, not the Hamitic myth, I'm sorry, the tragic mulatto myth. She believed that somehow, I did have a professor who also believed in the Hamitic myth, but the tragic mulatto myth, that somehow I didn't feel accepted anywhere. And I was like, what are you talking about? I know who I am.
Wait a minute,
And
you had a
so,
white professor at William and Mary who told you that you participated in a syndrome of being caught between races, that this is the
yes,
mulatto tragedy. And A, how dare this person say that to you? But B, this tells you how recent these difficulties
absolutely.
are.
And the thing is, I was complaining about some of the racism that I was experiencing from some of my classmates. And that was her response. So it was to put the responsibility on me,
Back
that
on
it's
you.
not them, it's me. And I was like, no, it's not me, it's them. And so those are, I mean, I've had people call me names, I've all kinds of stuff. And I've just found that the best antidote to all of that is to stand. And I go back to, Corinthians, having done all to stand therefore, with your whole armor. um and I find that helps me not to hate, not to be angry, although there are times when I do get angry, and to remind people that all the many, because there are about 14, 15 ethnicities that are running through my veins, that all of these ethnicities are part of who we are as Americans. And it is important to not only acknowledge that, because I tell people, hang on, I of all these different ethnicities, I have more European ethnic, that, like, the English is at the higher one, but you add all the others up, I'm a little bit more African than I am European, and I identify as African American, and I'm happy to identify as African American. And if I had a choice, I would identify as African American. And that's what shocks people. But I've learned over the years that you first have to know who you are. You have to accept, embrace, appreciate who you are. And all of the things that I've read about the journeys that people have had to go through, and especially African Americans, that all of that combined helps me as a human being to appreciate who I am without apology, to appreciate who I am. And I tell everyone, that's what you need to do. You need to look at and appreciate who you are, so that when criticisms, when you look at things historically and you see bad actors in every, or, nations acting badly, you don't take that personally. You can say, these people did some horrible things. And yes, my family group is part of that too, but that is not who I am. And I can understand, and that is horrible. And this is where we have come. That is the journey, I think, that people tend not to make in their lives, that they have to see all of this and to begin to understand even why people behave the way they do. Often it is selfish, reasoning going on, but it is also, it is also an understanding that you come to in seeing how you've operated and how you've reacted to things and how others have reacted to things. So over the years, over the many years of my life, I've gone from being very angry with, how people have reacted to me, to being a little bit more understanding, but at the same time taking a stance. I've had a lot of white people who have wanted to make sure that I knew I was Black. And my response has always been, well, I've never needed a white person to tell me I'm Black. And it's like, oh, I mean, I didn't mean anything. I said, yes, you did, but let me just explain a few things to you so you understand who I am. And once I do, then we move on. And their comfort level comes back, but they will always remember, don't step over that particular line anymore. It also helps them to kind of see what they've said, and maybe hopefully made them think a little bit more about their assumptions about life. And so that's been my personal journey with seeing prejudice. I lived in Black communities. I grew up in a community in which the city of Norfolk surrounded my community with two city dumps. One of them smack in the middle of my community. Those dumps did not exist prior to. They created them and put them there. And so I remind people that your experiences of this, and I know that they did not remediate that land to eliminate those toxins in the system. And so people still growing up in those neighborhoods are being exposed to that. And interestingly, the neighborhood I grew up in is now mixed, but it's with middle income people. It's important to know this and then to address and redress the harms that were done. And so my next, I guess, step in what I'm doing is looking at and identifying those areas that we need to fix in our society because of so many years of prejudice, discrimination that has been wielded by powerful people.
Absolutely. So I'm talking to Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander of Norfolk State about the larger questions of race dynamics in America. We don't have a lot of time left, but I want to ask you two important questions. One is my daughter took a course at her Eastern University about how groups get assimilated in American life. The sense of the course was that for a while the Irish get discriminated against and then they're sort of brought in, and for a while the Italians, and for a while, that there's kind of a coming of age thing that goes on when you come to America, and America likes to otherize the latest group, and it shifts over time. But the result of the course was every group gets assimilated except African Americans, and for some reason that's the group that's been there from the beginning that always gets close to that hurdle and then falls back. And of course, if that's true, and maybe that's not true, but I think it's true, that's just so tragic. And Jefferson was on to this. Jefferson is sort of our bellwether for all of this. He said the fact of race, of color, that these were former slaves and we were former masters, is always going to be part of the American dynamic, and it'll take centuries for this to dissipate, if ever. It's got to be so deeply upsetting to think that every group, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Philippine Americans, are eventually sort of grudgingly allowed into the club, but it's been African Americans who've had the toughest time of it.
I agree with that. I one thing that is clear if we go into the biology of people of African descent is that, as the original humans, Africans have a very strong DNA. And for so many white people, you have to assimilate, meaning you have to kind of disappear. And Black people just don't disappear. Our DNA is too strong for that. I mean, it takes a lot of generations for that to happen. And so I think that because yes, there's the guilt, yes, there's the fear, but I think the reality is more visual. Humans who have the ability to see are very, very visual. And the least difference is noticed. And if you are visually different, you are othered. And the moment you are no longer visually different, you are accepted. And I remind people also that when Theodore Roosevelt was, capitalizing on, and he didn't create the theory, but this whole idea of the melting pot, he wasn't talking about all the different races. He was talking about white people and how the Anglo-Saxon Protestants were decreasing in numbers. And so this idea of making all white people just white people was important. And that meant that Black people, Native peoples, would be othered even more during that period, which they were. And that's why you had a lot of passing going on.
Passing meaning of African American who can pass as white.
And Native peoples passing as white. And so you had a lot of that going on. And that also encouraged a lot of Asians coming in. That encouraged a lot of Hispanics coming in. Of course, Hispanic is a culture group. It's not a racial group. There's no look that we promote, but there's no real look in what a Hispanic person looks like. Because if you go to Cuba looks like the United States in terms of the color variations. You go to Colombia looks like the United States in terms of the color variations. When I was in Cartagena a few years ago, I thought I was back home because they were, the only difference was the language. So we have these perceptions, but they're often wrong. And I know I'm out of time in terms of running my mouth. But I just think that that eventually we will become a society as we break down this foundation of race that American leaders decided to create back in the 17th century. As we break down that foundation, and it's going to still take some time, we will become a different kind of society. But if you've grown up all your life, I mean, remember the Crayola situation with the color nude, which was based on white people's color. It takes a while for people to even recognize what they have made as an assumption about everyone because they're only thinking of themselves. As our society thinks outwardly more, not just inwardly, we will continue to grow in a different way. But but this is a critical moment where you just have a number, about a third of our population, that's going to go down that path, kicking and screaming. But they're getting fewer and fewer in numbers. But it's going to take some more time.
Cassandra, just this much as we close, and I'm 70, I'm not going to see this. You're 67, you're probably not going to see this time that we're talking about. But I will settle for a turnaround where we turn the republic around and move back towards more inclusion, more justice, more dignity, more agency. I'm sure your view too is just give us the turnaround.
Well, I think about in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president, and I thought I would never see that. And the fact that I saw it, and it happened so quickly, was shocking to me. And so these bright lights give you hope, but it also tells you what is eventually coming. And I think about that, and it gives me encouragement, because it tells me, even at a time when you think we're at our darkest, that's when change happens. But it has to happen if you help to make it happen.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this extraordinary conversation. I wish we could go on and on. We will. We'll meet again, of course. I'm talking to Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, professor of history at Norfolk State. I'm so pleased to be able to contact you and listen to your wisdom. For our listeners, we'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.